The Treatise of Wisdom, Part 1, The Scroll of Knowledge, by Edward Styler, Chapter 3. The commonary had been transformed over the course of the day. Where the food share had been, great beds of hot coals sizzled with the drippings of beasts being slowly turned by eager youngsters. Tables of breads and fruits and desserts of all kinds made a row along a wall, and men were busy setting up another row for the barrels of wine being rolled in. People laughed gaily with each other as they worked. Plates and cutlery clinked and clanked as they were set down. There were dozens of great long tables to set, all of them placed in concentric circular rows with a round table raised on a low platform in the center. An area was being set up adjacent to the cooking flats with a stage for musicians and dancing. Much of the townsfolk were happily doing this or that to get everything ready. Moss had found a job helping to string rows of lanterns over the entire courtyard. Chains were spanned overhead and fastened to iron rings in the stone walls that made up the perimeter. Moss and a few others were busy hanging the bulbous globular oil lamps. He stood atop a ladder and was reaching up with a lantern in his hands, trying to get its hook over the chain. He felt the ladder shake. "Hold on down there, you louse!" Moss shouted at Truffles, who was supposed to be holding the ladder. Truffles had turned to talk to a girl who was bringing baskets of grapes to the tables. The young lady laughed and continued on her way. "Sorry, mate, you know I can't resist a plump girl with food." Truffles grinned up at him. Moss grinned back and shook his head. "I hope I get drawn to sit at Miss Rain's table. She has the most ample bosom and hammy hips I've ever seen," Truffles said as Moss climbed down the ladder. "That's wishful thinking. You should get your eyes checked, too. You really think that someone who spends all her time walking around would have any plumpness to her?" To Moss, Rain looked as willowy and graceful as anyone he had ever seen. "She might use magic. Heck, if all girls could use magic, they'd probably use it to keep ample bosoms and round legs." Truffles stared off into space as he fantasized. "Come on," laughed Moss, clapping him on the shoulder. "Let's move the ladder." They continued the preparations until the sun began to set. People began pouring into the square as the lanterns were being lit. Everyone was dressed in their finest clothes, many with great frills at the sleeves and embroidered flowers and birds of all kinds and colors. Children squealed as they chased one another under the tables. The council members came in and sat at the common tables with friends and family. The table in the center remained empty. Presently, Life Touch addressed the crowd from the musician's stage. "Citizens of Fjord Harbor's Eye." All talking ceased, and people whispered excitedly. "We have, as our guest, the most honorable, the most wise, and the most welcome, Lady Rain of the world." People immediately began clapping. Life Touch raised a silencing hand and continued. "I will now make the draw for the honor of sitting at the center table." A large basket was placed beside him, and he shuffled his hands around inside it. All faces were turned to the basket, looking on hopefully. At last he pulled out a folded paper and read it. "Heavy Arm, the blacksmith." Someone in the crowd cheered loudly and rushed to the center table. Everyone laughed. "I hope we are all so eager," Life Touch said, and dug in for another name. "Rose, the sailmaker. Captain Morning of the cargo fleet. Fat Legs, the logger. Peeper of the Royal Library. Moss, the Tower's Eye. Straight Walker, the—" "You lucky dog," Truffle said to Moss. "Get a good look at her bottom for me." "You are a beast. Don't pout now, there's plenty of plum pudding here," Moss smiled as he moved off. "Oh, I'll be eating my fair share, believe me," Truffles called after him. The gathered citizens ceased talking and rose to their feet as Rain entered the square. Moss noticed how simple her clothes were in comparison to the fineries of her audience, but to him she nevertheless possessed the look of peerless nobility. She seemed not to have any weight as she walked beneath the ceiling of lanterns on her way to the center table. It was all in her eyes, he decided as she drew near. They carried both the weight of unfathomable time and the stellar radiance of enlightenment. Those eyes met his as she went round the table to her seat. He felt his mind turn to water, as if to carry his deepest thought to her. He felt terrified of the power behind those eyes, but the moment was brief in passing and left behind a lingering aftertaste of love and deep bliss. He understood then that only those with something to hide need fear that stare. When she came to her seat, she stood behind her chair and motioned for the gathering to be seated. "Thank you, citizens of Fjord Harbor's Eye, for the warmth of your welcome." She spoke in a gentle tone, but it seemed to be everywhere at once, as if conversing with each person in attendance individually. "It has been many years since I have traveled through the lands you call home, and though faces have changed, the quality of your character has not. Tomorrow I will be taking visitors who seek counsel or aid, and I will be here for 1 week, so those of you who need the kind of help that you cannot get elsewhere will have a chance to speak with me, and there will be no need to wait outside my door in an endless line. Now please enjoy yourselves this evening, and thank you for the preparations you have made in presenting this lovely gathering." At that, everyone cheered her and themselves and set into their merrymaking. Heaps of food were passed up and down the tables, and wine flowed like water. The courtyard was alight with laughter and storytelling. Rain entertained the people at the center table with stories of far-off places and old histories of their own land. The time slipped away, and Moss saw by the stars that his watch shift would be beginning soon. He waited until Rain was between stories, then slipped away. As he made his way through the raucous crowd, he saw Aimless sitting by herself on an upturned wine barrel adjacent to cooking fires. She was poking at the embers with a stick as she drank from a stein. Moss figured he had a little time before his watch, so he rolled an empty barrel over to the fire and sat beside her. "Having a good night?" he asked. "Yes," she replied. "How was Rain?" "Very interesting. It's strange being near her. You don't feel quite like yourself. She has an authority about her, but it isn't at all like that of the council. It's hard to say what it's like." He watched the end of Aimleth's stick probe the coals. "It's authority based on that which you cannot argue, pure truth." She handed her heavy stein to Moss. "You've been awake a long time to be starting a shift. Have some of this. It'll keep you alert." Moss took the cup. The drink was hot and sweet, and was strong with exotic spices. "Thanks, it's good. I can't say I've tasted anything like it." "It's called Honey of Del Torre. Drink it all." "What do you mean by authority based on pure truth?" Moss asked. Aimleth had a lingo all her own, though she never seemed to take offense at not being understood. "Well," she began, "take the council for example. They have a set of regulations and laws for Highland. The laws basically distinguish between which is good and which is bad. However, other nations each have a different set of laws which may contradict ours. Each nation is sure of their law's correctness, so who is wrong and who is right? The answer is none and all. Each set of rules is made by people to suit the circumstances of a particular time with particular goals. When you strip away all the human-made rules, you are left with the fundamental truths. They transcend all time and encompass all life, not just some people at some moment." Moss stared at her a moment. Who is she? He thought. So why don't the nations use these fundamental truths instead of their own laws if they are better? They are not better, they are simply more pure. Society is too complex and too specifically human to be governed by them. The truths make their way into our laws. Unbeknownst to us, they quite often form the basis of our logic, and by their encompassing nature it is impossible for a stable society to stray from their guidance. Most people simply don't put a name to them, so they do not consider them. Moss looked confused. So what are the truths then, and how do you know about all this? Amleth continued to stare into the fire. The path to understanding is a long one. It must be lived and cannot be told. I know because I've walked the path, and still walk the path. Moss didn't quite know what to say. He hadn't the faintest idea of what she was talking about. Even so, he was intrigued by the mystery. He thought it was a shame that her quirkiness kept people from befriending her, but then she had never sought out companionship with the people of Fjordharbor's since she had arrived many years ago. Maybe she preferred things as they were. In a way, he felt lucky to know her, if ever so slightly. She was very uncommon, and it seemed he was the only one she ever talked to on a personal basis. I don't think I've ever heard you talk this much before, Moss teased. Amleth shrugged. She looked up at the stars. You need to go. Moss glanced up. Yes. Well, I'll talk to you later. Thanks for the drink. I feel wide awake. Moss left her sitting by the fire and went to his post on Gate Tower. Tell me about your friend. Amleth turned her head and saw Rain approach and sit on the barrel Moss was just occupying. No one else seemed to notice the guest of honor, and went about their partying without pause or glance. It is not my place to be speaking of others, Amleth replied. Rain studied her a moment. Amleth placidly stirred the fire with her stick. That is an honorable stance. Tell me about yourself, then. What would you like to know? Are you happy here, in Fjordharbor's Rain asked. Happy enough, but not content, Rain said. Amleth remained silent. Tell me about your life here, Rain asked. I help with the hunting and the felling of trees for the ships, Amleth replied impassively. Yet your plate contains no meat and you can't take your eyes from the burning bodies of the trees you helped cut down, said Rain in a gentle voice. Amleth looked up, with a slight touch of sorrow in her eyes. It's all I can do which these people value. There are other things you can do. Amleth met Rain's eyes. If you can see that, then you know they are things that I would not sell. I know of people who do, said Rain. As do I, but they are pretenders. They will never understand that path, Amleth said vehemently. Rain studied her thoughtfully. Why do you stay here? Amleth paused before answering. I came here when I was young. I suppose I got used to the ease of life afforded by these great settlements. All things come at a cost, Rain said. Yes. Though for someone like you that cost is great, too great not to be balanced by something else. There is another reason you stay, isn't there? Said Rain. Yes. Amleth breathed. Perhaps I can help, Rain said gently. Meet me on the west beach, by the floating rock, at midnight tomorrow. She smiled and disappeared into the crowd as discreetly as she had arrived. A smile eased onto Amleth's face. She felt a warm, lingering feeling of hope, and an inkling of the excitement which accompanies change. Softfoot mingled with the jovial crowd with the usual banter reserved for people of casual acquaintance. However, on that eve he had a clandestine purpose behind his offhand joking. He was trying to judge the tenor of people's general moods and views behind their social masks. For the most part, he didn't detect anything out of the ordinary. But in thinking this, he remembered what Rain had said in council. These dangers have been building since the first people came to these lands. What is ordinary, then, is where the problem lies, he concluded. He began searching for deeper meaning. He soon found himself simply strolling through the crowd, picking up wisps of conversation. He taxed his mind. It was all normal. There were no hints of discontent among matters concerning the state of the nation. There were no notions of disloyalty or treachery. These people were thoroughly enjoying themselves, both now and, it seemed, in their daily lives. They prided themselves in their families, in their accomplishments, in their homes and belongings. They all seemed to strive to improve their lives. They all seemed decent, peaceful people. So where is this elusive danger? It can't be present in these good citizens. Perhaps they will be the victims of some greater manipulations, but from what influence? There will be no front. It will boil from within each nation, each person. Rain's words echoed through his mind. These people are ordinary. Their thoughts are ordinary. What amongst all this ordinary is so elusively disastrous? He ceased to hear or see the crowd. His mind had retreated inward, searching for meaning. He stopped for a moment. He paused as a thought went through his brain like a great shark through a school of fish, scattering all around it until it is all alone in an empty sea. These people are no different than myself. Their thoughts, their lives mirror my own. I cannot see the problem because I am part of the problem. The shark swam on and left behind only current and vacancy. Softfoot stood alone, a still island in a shimmering sea of laughing and eating and dancing people. He looked around himself. Smiling faces whirled about him. The sounds of the party seemed to be merely on the distant horizon. He saw the party as a living entity, manifesting itself with the spirit of all the people joined in common purpose, and he, the lone island, was separated, severed in mind, left staring at the beast. The beast drove its subjects on, compelling them in action, yet with all its untouchable supremacy, it was sitting on a throne suspended by a single thread above a bottomless pit. The moment the people decided the party was over, the thread would snap, the beast would die, and the people would return to their everyday lives. As he gazed about the smoke and the throng, he saw a young woman who was not laughing, not dancing, but sitting alone in thought on a barrel, poking the fire and drinking from a large stein, a second island in the sea. He had been on the council that had granted her citizenship. She had been an outsider, and as his memory worked its course, he felt that she had always been separate from the mind of the community in this way. He went over to her quickly. "Amelith," said Softfoot, "may I have a word with you?" "Yes, of course, Chancellor Softfoot," she said. "I would prefer a private setting. The council chamber will be empty," he said. "You don't mind leaving the feast for a while?" "No, it's all right." She hopped onto her feet and followed Softfoot out of the courtyard. She had never been inside the council chamber before. She had heard of it, of course, but to be in it was altogether different. She hesitated before walking onto the glass floor. "It's all right, my dear, it's quite strong," said Softfoot, pulling out a chair for her before sitting in another. With the dark courtyard far below and the starlit night all around, it really did look like the tables and chairs, and Softfoot for that matter, were all floating in the heavens. She crossed the floor and sat adjacent to Softfoot, merging with the illusion. He studied her for a moment, wondering how to begin. In fact, he didn't quite know exactly what it was he was looking for, only that he had a feeling this young woman held some beginning of an answer. He noticed that she sat calmly, at absolute ease, confident in a situation she knew nothing about. Most people outside the council who were brought into the chambers fidgeted and were generally nervous, but not she. She sat with her eyes locked on his, silently, perhaps politely, waiting for him to disclose his purpose. It is a beautiful night. The town is caught right up in the excitement of the feast, Softfoot mused as he watched the party outside the windowed floor. He looked at Amleth, expecting a reply, but she merely resumed eye contact. It's as if the party has a life of its own, he said, as if simply commenting on his gaiety. What do you think, Amleth? Amleth raised an eyebrow. Yes, it is quite lively, she said. What's that? Softfoot asked, pretending to have been lost in something out the window for a moment. The party, she reminded him. Oh yes, the party is quite lively indeed, he said. And the people too. The distinction was not lost on Amleth. Her eyes caught his again, searching them deeper, and she saw the subtle hint of knowing Softfoot hoped she would find. What would you like to ask me, Chancellor? About what? He feigned. About the Overmind, she replied. Overmind. He rolled the word through his mouth. Clearly that is what you are hinting at, she said. Possibly, though the word is unfamiliar to me, he said. You must have gained sight of it and then noticed you weren't alone, right? She asked. Excitement grew on Softfoot's face. How did you learn of it? He asked. Amleth shrugged her shoulders. It was taught to me at an early age. Then, to parry any inquiry, she asked, Why all the secrecy? He quickly thought up a half-truth. Any device that can be used for monitoring or controlling a crowd for the interests of public safety must be kept secret if it is to be effective. She didn't appear to question that, so he went on. What can you tell me about this Overmind? She shrugged her shoulders again before answering. Apparently it was common sense to her. The Overmind is everywhere, is everything. Each Overmind being within another Overmind. You saw the party out there. First a person making merry, then people making merry, all for a common purpose, all behaving as one. It was then that you saw the Overmind of the party. It, in itself, is a small part of the Overmind of Fjord Harbor's Eye, which is a small part of the Overmind of Highland, which is a small part of the Overmind of humanity, which is a small part of the Overmind of all life. Do we control the Overmind, or does it control us? The answer is both. Our lives and minds are controlled by an Overmind until we decide to change our ways. Then, as we live in our new direction, we assume an altered Overmind, and so the cycle continues. Ultimately, everything produces and is produced by the Overmind of the universe, an unfathomable entity brought to conscious life by that which it creates. Further, through life, the Overmind of the universe is self-aware. We are part of the universe. We are made of it. When we look at the stars, we are the universe looking at itself. For the second time that evening, Softfoot was shocked by a grander realization. He stared, unblinking, into Amleth's placid eyes. How easily the hidden truths wafted through her lips. Instantly, his mind related his thoughts to Jai Khan. His mouth went agape. Surely you speak of a fundamental truth, he gasped. I do. Softfoot lifted his face to the stars, and a tear streamed back down his cheek. To the practitioner of Jai Khan, the search for fundamental truths was the reason for being. In his moment of enlightenment, Softfoot had another realization. He looked at Amleth in wonder. You must follow the path. She stared at him impassively. You should have told us. We would have found you a more useful job to fulfill. What path do you follow? Jai Khan? The arts? Hunting and woodcutting suits me well, was all she said. Truly, though, we need the skills of those who walk the path, he said, somewhat surprised by her refusal. I'm sorry, I can't help you in that way. Please don't make anyone think anything more of me than they presently do. The meaning in her eyes was clear to Softfoot. Any information that goes beyond us will hinder my way on the path. Of course, Amleth. We may trust each other to hold our tongues, he said politely, bowing his head to her as an equal. She bowed back. Moss stood at his post on Gate Tower. Night watch was most often a very solemn duty, but this eve he had a content smile on his face. The music and laughter of the feast rolled through the air, and he was warm and happy from Rain's presence and aimless drink. He loved mystery and stories. Rain was so different from the people of Fjord Harbor's Eye, he thought dreamily. She seemed to convey such wonder and magic in the simplest of things. Her stories detailed not only the grand events of nations and nature, but also made grand the doings of the tiny creatures of the world. He could certainly identify with this appreciation for each simple life form. He was called Moss on the day of his naming, in part because he lived with great interest of all that was natural. So isolated in thought was he that it was several moments before he realized that he wasn't alone. He whirled around, prepared to sound the alarm, but fell mute when he found himself staring straight into the eyes of Rain. He was captivated by those eyes, which seemed to radiate a silver blue light. He felt weak in the knees. He felt like collapsing prostrate before her feet, but he was paralyzed. She put a slender hand to his and gazed into the depths behind his eyes. Moss felt a strange and subtle connection with her which lingered, then faded. "Tell me about your dreams," she said a moment later, still lightly clasping his hand. He felt flustered. He couldn't speak. He wanted to melt into her hand. My dreams?" he stammered. "Yes, your special dreams." Her eyes shimmered. She seemed to have somehow flowed into features more lovely and mysterious than he remembered. He began talking randomly. "They are real. Sometimes I am chased. I never get caught. I often remember them as though they really happened. They are usually in places I've never been, but they are such vivid, detailed worlds, more often real than reality, with colors and smells richer than anything. I've begun to have a feeling that my dreams are trying to teach me something. Sometimes," he brought his voice down to a whisper, "sometimes I feel as though the dreams are not of my own mind." "What do you take them to mean?" she asked, pressing her stare. "I don't know," he gasped, as the weight of her will and her beauty crushed his mind. "Though the answer seems to be trying to make itself known, I feel as though it is just on the very tip of my tongue, but fades as I try to think about it." "Then it is best not to think about it, and let the answer reveal itself when its time comes." Her eyes flashed again. "I know of someone who can help you sort this out. Meet me tomorrow at midnight on the west beach by the floating rock." She smiled softly, releasing her hand from his, and silently disappeared down the stairs of the tower. Moss let out a long sigh as he leaned back against a merlin. The warmth and peace of her presence washed through his body and lingered there. He felt a whirl of excitement in his belly. Something in him was important enough for a person like Rain to take notice. The frontier of self-discovery became a vast, uncharted land before him, and he had just been offered a map.